Tahira, thank you for the opportunity to do this. The book, Asia Reborn, my book is the first comprehensive modern history of Asia, covering the whole of Asia, told from an Asian perspective. I think the Asian perspective is especially important because most books about Asia are written from a Western perspective, and very few books cover the whole of Asia. It's important, I hope I'll show you that looking at Asia as a single entity is worthwhile because different parts of Asia affect each other. And the interesting thing about the book is that I look at how Asia came to be colonized by various Western powers by the beginning of the 20th century, and how over the next 50 to 60 years, Asia threw off the colonial yoke and then began this extraordinary journey to prosperity that has made Asia the most dynamic region of the world economy. So how do you start? Well, if you think about Asia today, for instance, when the Europeans were writing about Asia, they did some interesting things. For instance, Mahathir, 2 years ago, when Mahathir was talking about his political rival Najib, he called him a Bougainese pirate, a pirate from Bugis. Now, it is interesting that the notion of people of Bugis being pirates came from the colonial period, because the Bougainese and the Makassaris were some of the great mariners of this region. But to the Europeans, they were called pirates. But of course, the real pirates were the Europeans. They were in these waters. The waters belonged to the Bougainese and the Makassaris. The real pirates were the Europeans. So if you turn the lens back, you begin to see a different perspective. And if you think about the word freebooter, freebooter comes from a Dutch word. And the Dutch word freebooter emerges from the fact that there were great ships that used to travel between the southern coast of India and Aceh in Sumatra, carrying massive amounts of textiles. And the Dutch, particularly, and later the British, began to mount these ships. And they mounted the ships, and they called themselves freebooters for doing it. They mounted the ships, and they took everything that was on there. Massive amounts of booty were taken over. And that is how the colonial period began. But at the beginning of the 20th century, all of Asia lay supine. The only exception really was Japan, and to a small degree, Thailand. Now, what I do is I look at why it is that by 1950, the parts of Asia that were ruled by the Europeans the longest were the poorest. So the parts of Asia that were ruled longest by the Europeans was the eastern part of India, what is today Bangladesh, West Bengal, Orissa, Assam, Bihar, and the coastal parts of Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu. They were the poorest parts of Asia. And the wealthiest parts, the most prosperous, the most industrialized parts of Asia were those that had been ruled by Japan. So there is something to this. Now, if you think about Taiwan, which had been ruled by Japan for 50 years, in 1950, Taiwan's life expectancy at birth was 55 years. The life expectancy at birth in India, undivided British India, was 32 years. That was worse even than the African average. The African average at that point was 38 years, really quite low, partly because they had also been conquered and ruled by various European powers for long periods of time. But India's was the lowest in the world. And the literacy rate in India was just 14%. Just 1/7 of all the population could read and write. And what I found along the way is that Iraq, which was also ruled by Britain from 1920 to 1958, when the British were removed from Iraq in 1958, the literacy rate in Iraq turned out to be the same 14%, the same as India in 1947. So the British and other European powers educated only a thin veneer of the elite. The vast majority of the population lived in abject poverty and became poorer over time. Now, if you think about India and China, India, through most of history, was the world's largest economy. At the time of Christ's birth, India accounted for 32.9% of world GDP. By 1700, when the British began to arrive, India's share of world GDP was still 24.5%. So nearly a quarter of world GDP was coming from India. By 1900, that share was down to 4%. And similarly, China, once China came under the control, particularly its ports came under the control of various European powers, in the course of the 19th century, China's share of world GDP shrank very quickly from about 16% in 1820 to about 5.5% by 1900. And so Asia, which used to be the most prosperous part of the world for most of history, had been reduced to poverty, mass poverty, and laissez-faire. Now, what was interesting is that Japan was really the first Asian power to begin to demonstrate that it could stand up to the Europeans and the Americans, particularly the Americans. Now, what happened with Japan, of course, is that Japan tried to resist when the black ships of Commodore Perry arrived in 1854, but they realized that they couldn't do very much. And so they decided that they needed to change and they needed to adopt some of the best features of the Western powers while holding on to the cultural and civilizational roots of Japan, which is what they did after the Meiji Restoration. In 1868, they had a wholesale change, and thereafter, over the next 40 years, Japan developed at a rapid pace. And so in 1894-95, there was a war between Japan and China. The old fading Qing dynasty, or the Manchu dynasty of China, was defeated. Now, what is interesting is that 3 years after this defeat, there was a triple intervention by three European powers, Germany, France, and Russia. They intervened on behalf of China, and they said, well, Japan, you've won that war, and you've taken over some territory that you won in that war, including Taiwan. You can keep Taiwan, but the rest of the territory, you should give it back to China. And so Japan almost willingly agreed to give it back to China. But within 6 months, the territory that Japan had given back to China was occupied by those three European powers and a fourth one, Britain. So 4 European powers quickly occupied all the territories in China that had been given back to China by Japan. And that was the nature of the world that existed then. And this sort of thing continued. So then, of course, in 1905, Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. This was a sensational event because Russia was one of the great powers. It was one of the 3 or 4 great powers that determined what was happening across Europe and consequently across the whole of the world. And when Russia was defeated, it was defeated abjectly. They lost the Battle of Mukden, or what is now called Shenyang in northeastern China. They lost the Battle of Mukden on land, but worst of all, the entire Baltic fleet of the Russians was sunk by the navy headed by Admiral Togo at Tsushima Straits in 1905, in May 1905, and that was the first sign that an Asian power was able to compete and defeat a European one. And that began a huge change in Asia's subsequent history. So one of the consequences, of course, was that Korea in 1910 came under Japanese rule, and the Koreans still feel that Japan was awful to them. There is no doubt that all colonial powers behave very badly towards those they colonize. And the Koreans have every right to feel aggrieved about the period of Japanese rule. But I think the Koreans got a bit lucky. If they had fallen to the Russians instead, if the Russians had won the war, then we might not have had too many friends called Kim and Choi, etc. We would have had friends called Kimov and Choisky. Because if you think about the parts of Asia that were ruled by Russia then, places like Azerbaijan, the ruler of Azerbaijan, the first ruler of modern Azerbaijan after the Soviet Union fell, was called Gaidar Aliyev. His real name is Haidar Ali, but it was Russified. Haidar became Gaidar and Ali became Aliyev. And similarly, you had Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan, you had Karimov, and you had all. So similarly, the Koreans, had they come under Russian rule, would probably have names like Kimov and Choisky, and their identity would have been utterly smothered. The Japanese didn't do that. They didn't smother the identity completely. In fact, in 1919, the Japanese introduced Korean into the schools. And so students could learn both Korean and Japanese. Of course, the Koreans felt aggrieved and still, with good reason, feel aggrieved about having to learn Japanese, but they were able to learn Korean as well. This, for instance, in the Philippines did not happen. In the Philippines, first they learned Spanish. Hardly anybody in the country learned it because it was so difficult for them. And then they were forced to learn American English. Again, very few people properly learned American English. And so the education that they were receiving didn't go very far. And so if you look at literacy rates, the literacy rate in Taiwan and South Korea, and actually the whole of Korea, was around 60% at the end of the Second World War. In India, as I said, it was 14%. In Malaya, it was about 23%. Slightly better because they hadn't been ruled that long by the British, so they held on to their education, their indigenous education systems a bit better, but it was really much lower than in Japan, in the Japanese ruled parts. Moving on, what you find is that if you look today, I compare Malaysia and Korea, South Korea. What is interesting is that both Malaysia and South Korea tried to industrialize using the Japanese model of industrialization. And they were trying to emulate it. So when Korea began its process of emulating Japan, among other things, there was a company called POSCO, Pohang Iron and Steel Company, that collaborated with Nippon Steel to begin steel production in 1968 or thereabouts. And Hyundai Motors, as we know, a major world manufacturer of cars today, Hyundai Motors began to collaborate with Mitsubishi Motor around the same time. By about the mid-1970s, POSCO, Pohang Iron and Steel, was one of the world's major steel producers. And by 1979, Pohang Iron and Steel was giving advice to US Steel. There was a Pittsburgh, California plant of US Steel that was effectively handed over to POSCO to try and change the technology and improve it. Now, why did this happen? Now, at the same time, about 15 years later, Malaysia also cooperated with Nippon Steel to try and create a steel company in Malaysia. It was called Perwata Steel. And they tried to create a motor car company called Proton, which if you drive into Malaysia, you'll find lots of Proton cars. Those were, again, in collaboration with Mitsubishi Motor. Now notice that Hyundai has become a world-class car company. Proton is still struggling, even at home. What is the difference? The difference is the quality of education and the nature of industrialization and colonialism in the two places. So in Japan-occupied Korea, there were 6 steel mills established. If you have 6 steel mills in the country, lots of people acquire the technical skills to run a steel mill. There are engineers, there are technicians, etc., who know how to run a steel mill. So when technology was being transferred by Nippon Steel, the people at Pohang Iron and Steel could tap the engineering abilities of those who had worked in the old Japanese era steel mills. And consequently, they could assess the technology, take in the best aspects, and then put it to work in South Korea. In Malaysia, there was no engineering school at all. In fact, when I first visited Kuala Lumpur in 1993, I met the science advisor to the Prime Minister, a wonderful man, a very interesting and wonderful man. He was a PhD, but he was a PhD in veterinary science. There were no engineering schools in the country. There was very few people with the ability to understand technology. The science advisor to the Prime Minister was a vet. Marvelous man. But now, the ability to absorb technology didn't exist. And so when Proton tried to produce cars, it struggled. And Powaja Steel never made a single year of profit. So different from POSCO, Pohang Iron and Steel. Same collaborator, but very different outcomes. So, to my mind, this is one of the positive aspects of Japanese rule. The fact that not only did they have steel mills, they even had a Korea Shipbuilding and Engineering Corporation that was established. And it's no wonder that today, Korea is the world's largest shipbuilder. It started during the Japanese period. Of course, most of the top engineers there were Japanese, but there were enough technicians, enough people who learned the skills in Korea. Korea, of course, built on that with tremendous engineering schools of their own. And as a result, Korea became a very successful industrial power. Now, if you think about Asia today, the successful industrial powers are Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and today, of course, China. If you look at the parts of China that are prosperous today, they are precisely the only parts of China that are genuinely prosperous and industrialized are the parts that were ruled by Japan for about at least 7 years, and in many cases for about 14 years. But the most industrialized part is what is called Manchuria. That word no longer exists. 3 big provinces in the northeast of China used to be called Manchuria. Today, well, not so much today, but certainly in the 1950 to 2000 period, the second half of the 20th century, by far the most industrialized part of China was Manchuria. The car producing hub of China is still the capital of Jilin province, Changchun. And that place became a car manufacturer during the Japanese period. The first Nissan production plant was not in Japan at all, but in Changchun in China. So this is the difference. Now, there are other aspects. If you think about the way Japan ruled, during the Second World War, Japan conquered the whole of Asia east of India in a 6-month blitz, starting, of course, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, by the way, is in Hawaii. Hawaii, at that time, was not a state of the United States. It was a colony of the United States. And interestingly, in Hawaii, at that time, 40% of the population was of Japanese descent. Only 15% were white Americans. But anyway, and also, Pearl Harbor was slightly closer to Tokyo than to Washington, D.C. Anyway, the interesting point is that after Pearl Harbor, within the next 6 months, the whole of East Asia was liberated from colonial rule by the Japanese. Now, many of them didn't feel it was liberation because you were conquered by a new power, Japanese. But interestingly, Japan declared the independence of the Philippines on the 14th of October, 1943. And the Second Republic was headed by the most prominent Filipino, Jose Laurel. And today, if you drive in the highlands, you'll find a big Jose Laurel highway. So they still remember him well. It is considered the Second Republic of the Philippines. When America declared the so-called independence of the Philippines on the 4th of July, 1946, America retained 22 military bases. No Filipino could enter those military bases unless accompanied by an American. Was that independence? What is interesting is that the Japanese so-called collaborationist regime is called a puppet regime. Jose Laurel was no puppet. He was nobody's puppet. the Speaker of the Assembly then was a man called Benigno Aquino I. He was nobody's puppet. They were an independent country, at least as independent as they became in 1946 under so-called American suzerainty with 22 military bases. Similarly, in Myanmar, what is today called Myanmar, then called Burma, the Burmese military under the British Burma Army contained no Bamars. Bamars are 60% of the population of Burma. The main ethnic group are the Burmese, or the Bamars. They're 60%. There was not a single Bamar in the British Burma army because the British believed in divide and rule. So they had Karens, they had Kachins, they had Chins, but they had no Bamars. The first Bamar army, the first proper Burmese army, was put together by a man called Aung San in collaboration with Japan. And he came in with the Japanese. And on the 1st of August, 1943, Burma was declared independent. What was this independence? The prime minister of the new Burma was the man who had won the election in Burma under British rule in both 1932 and 1937. Ba Maw, his name was. Perfectly legitimate elected prime minister. So I would say that this is really the legacy of Japanese rule. In fact, not only that, in Indonesia, the first thing that the Japanese did was to release Sukarno and Hatta from jail. The Dutch had kept Sukarno in jail for 10 consecutive years. 13 of the previous 15 years he was in jail. He was released by the Japanese and told that he was free to start his nationalist movement. At the same time, the Japanese introduced Bahasa Indonesia into the schools. They replaced Dutch with Bahasa Indonesia. In the Philippines, they replaced American English with Tagalog as the language of instruction. And so I say in my book, and I've come to this conclusion after looking at the evidence, just as Napoleon helped create a united Germany and a united Italy for the first time and demonstrated the possibilities of new nations in Europe, similarly, Japan did the same in the Philippines and Indonesia and Burma. Of course, that is now, interestingly, in China, the person who so-called collaborated with Japan was called Wang Jingwei. Wang Jingwei was the rival of Chiang Kai-shek in the Kuomintang. He was the next man, and in fact, he had served as prime minister of China under Chiang Kai-shek until about 2 years before he became president of the so-called Japanese-occupied China. It was not Japanese-occupied in the sense it was independent, but that is the real story. Now, look further on. My book also looks at Iran and Iraq. Why are Iran and Iraq in such trouble? Or in fact, if you look at Lebanon, recently we had this enormous explosion at Beirut port in Lebanon. What is the problem in Lebanon? Well, Lebanon was created by the French, primarily with the allies that they had there. The allied ethnic group in Lebanon to the French were the Maronite Christians. And they created a country called Lebanon. If you look at just the governorate of Mount Lebanon, it is largely Maronite Christian. But they tried to expand that country to include as much territory as possible while keeping a slight 51% majority of Christians. And this extreme ambition created a hodgepodge country that has struggled ever since. It's had tremendous amounts, it had almost constant civil war. And it is purely a result of the divide and rule and the excessive greed of the French. So the day after the bomb, gas burst in Beirut harbor, President Macron visited. So the old colonial legacy remains. Now, let's look at Iran and Iraq. Why is Iraq such a problem country today? Well, partly because in 1920, at the end of the First World War, Iraq was artificially put together. There were 3 vilayats in the Ottoman Empire called Mosul, which is mainly Kurdish. There was Baghdad, which was mainly Arab Sunni, and there was Basra, which was mainly Arab Shia. These 3 were separate vilayats under the Ottoman Empire. They were put into one, and they created an artificial country of Iraq. They brought a man from the Hijaz, from Makkah, and made him the king of this country. He was a Sunni who did not even belong to that country called Iraq, but he was the British puppet monarch of Iraq. And that dynasty remained from 1920 until 1958, and the British effectively remained in control. In 1930, they so-called declared the independence of Iraq. But during the war, the elected prime minister of Iraq, called Rashid Ali, had basically said that Iraq is going to be neutral in the Second World War. When he said that, the British said nothing doing. And what did? They brought the British Indian Army under the command of General Wavell and General Auchinleck, and they invaded Iraq, took it over, removed the elected prime minister, Rashid Ali, and installed a puppet prime minister who was pro-British. Then they went to Iran, the neighboring country. Why were Iran and Iraq so important? Because these were the two countries that had oil then. They had enormous amounts of oil. Saudi Arabia's oil had not yet been discovered. All the oil in Iraq and Iran was owned by the British companies. A single British company each case. And the British company in Iran was called Anglo-Persian Oil Company. So what did they do? There was a joint Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran in late August, early September 1941. Just think, what happened? The Shah of Iran was a modernizer. He had modernized Iran. He had introduced all kinds of new technologies and a great education, modern education system, etc. But he was removed through a joint Anglo-Soviet invasion. The Anglo, of course, was actually Indian, mainly Indian troops under British command that came in, took over Iran. Now, later, after the war, long after the war, the British were still completely in control of Iran, but almost by accident, a man called Mosadek became the elected prime minister of Iran. And one of the first things he did was he basically offered the Anglo-Persian Oil Company an opportunity to share the revenues a bit better with the people of Iran. They refused, and so he nationalized the company. Mosadek was completely opposed to the Soviets as well, because he knew that the Soviets had invaded his country as well. He hated both the Soviets and the British. He wanted to collaborate with the Americans, and as long as Truman was there, there was a fair degree of collaboration. Once he was removed and he had a Republican administration, there was a coup, a CIA-led coup that replaced Mosadek. And what remained then? If the main nationalist is removed, you either have the feckless Shah of Iran, who was considered a puppet of the West because he was reinstalled by the Americans and the British, or you have the religious fanatics. And essentially, that became the conflict in Iran in the subsequent 25 years. And in 1979, you had the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And so Iran is today a big problem country for the world, partly because the West did some awful things. The nationalists who wanted a fair deal from the development and sharing of oil revenues in his own country was removed. And so you see this across Asia. You had serious problems everywhere. Now, once the Europeans and the other Western powers were removed, Asia began to develop on its own. And the countries that adopted what I would call the Japanese model grew much faster. Not only did they grow much faster, it is interesting that Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea not only are the most prosperous countries in Asia today, they also have the most equal distribution of income. Why is that? That is because when the Japanese came in, the first thing that they did was they had a big land reform, and they ensured that the returns from speculation in land were never too great. It was always better to be an entrepreneur doing industry in producing goods and services rather than simply speculating in land. Of course, there was a brief exception. 1985 to 90 in Japan was the exceptional period after the Plaza Accord, which under which Japan had agreed to appreciate the currency. Massive amounts of capital flowed into Japan as a result, and you had an asset bubble. But with that brief 5-year exception, Japan has never allowed land speculation to be a big source of money creation in Japan. And so that contributes to a much more equal distribution of income there than anywhere else in Asia, especially in China and India. You look at China today, it is one of the most unequal countries in the world. It is ironic that China is communist, but it is extremely unequal. The income distribution is much more skewed in China than it is anywhere else in Asia. Now, what did China do? China adopted what I call the Singapore model. Singapore model was very similar to the Japanese, except that the Singapore model involved not building up domestically owned industries, but depending much more on multinational corporations to drive the export sector. What happened as a result was that the domestic entrepreneurial class focused instead primarily on real estate. And that, of course, makes the distribution of income much more unequal. And so in Singapore and Southeast Asia, where the Singapore model is adopted, and in China, you had the same thing. The initial dynamic export sector was primarily driven by foreign invested companies. And so the domestic capital that existed, lots of domestic capital existed, all of it went towards what I call renting and rent seeking. So largely property and other forms of government-linked corporate activity that would generate excess returns and skew the distribution of income. And so I would say that when the rest of the world is looking at Asia for examples, they should be looking to Japan, Korea, and Taiwan as the countries to emulate. Those are the three genuine success stories, the only instances of countries that have gone from poverty to complete prosperity in the world. There are no other examples like this, of these three countries going from poverty to prosperity within about a 50-year period. And during those 50 years, they ensured that the distribution of income was much more equal than anywhere else. And so I'd say that these are beautiful examples that we all need to try and adopt the best features and discard some of the bad ones. Of course, the fact that Japan colonized Korea and Taiwan is not something that particularly the Koreans are very unhappy about, with good reason. The Taiwanese are not that unhappy because the Taiwanese feel that they got a more raw deal under the Kuomintang, because the Kuomintang, the KMT, Chiang Kai-shek, came and took over ownership of everything that the Japanese had left behind. And so interlopers basically took over the country. They felt that things were fairer under the Japanese than under the KMT. And that's why today you have a Taiwan Nationalist Party headed by Tsai Ing-wen as the ruling party. And they won a landslide victory this year. So this is the story of Asia distilled into an half-hour segment. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. Thank you. So are there any questions? Should I, Bogdan, I think Bogdan has an interesting question. How can this distribution be traced back a cultural common root? Well, as an economist, I prefer not to use cultural explanations, because if you think back to Max Weber, when Max Weber was writing about the Protestant ethic and its impact on capitalism, he also had chapters on how the Confucian ethic is terrible and it frustrates the ability to have industrial development. And so the point is, the cultural legacy, no matter what your cultural legacy, you can adapt the cultural legacy, bring out the best features of it to make a national story that works better. And I think every aspect of a cultural legacy can be molded towards a more equal, egalitarian outcome, as well as a progressive, industrializing outcome. So I hope that answers your question, Bob. So Talula asks, how much time did you spend on the research? Well, I would say that I spent 25 years researching the book. Most of my working life, of course, I was an economist working in Asia. And so I really got into the nitty-gritty of understanding what drove each Asian economy. And you'll find that in the book. I think you'll find that there's a lot of detail about each country's story. And so I would say I spent about 25 years researching it, and I spent about 3 years writing the book. I had some interesting stories. One, I lost my laptop in Chicago airport once, but luckily the security kept the laptop. It had 1.5 chapters of my book. Thankfully, airport security in Chicago was so good that they sent me the laptop at my next destination in San Francisco 2 days later. Okay, so Wai Ching asks, I am interested and concerned about neocolonialism. What views do you have on China's economic power by offering aid to various countries such as Africa? Yes, unfortunately, China's approach to Africa, not just Africa, but to many other countries, is really very neocolonial. And the neocolonial aspect of it is, the worrying aspect is that when China builds infrastructure in Africa or even in Malaysia, what it does is that it not only brings its own equipment, all its own capital goods, it even brings labor from China. Now, in a country, in areas like Africa or India or Malaysia, there is a fair amount of labor available. Okay, less so in Malaysia, but certainly I went to the Hyderabad airport when I was at Khazanah in Malaysia. We were helping to build the Hyderabad airport, and it was interesting that some part of the airport had been given to a Chinese contractor, and they had Chinese workers. There were signs in Chinese in Hyderabad airport in India. India is a country with massive labor surpluses, but even in India, they were using Chinese labor. So this is definitely a troublesome aspect of China's approach. And this China's approach, what is called the Belt and Road Initiative, has run into a lot of political resistance in places like, even now, like Sri Lanka, the Maldives, and of course Africa, and in Malaysia, where Mahathir basically told Premier Li Keqiang in Beijing, standing next to him, he said, you really, the Chinese should think twice about unequal treaties. Now, that was the unkindest cut. Unequal treaties are what China was subjected to by the Europeans for 100 years, until 1943. And he used the term unequal treaties to refer to the way, Mahathir, to refer to the way the Chinese were dealing with its economic partners. And yes, this is definitely troubling. The neocolonial aspects of what China does in parts of the world, and particularly, of course, in Africa and many parts of Asia, including Sri Lanka, where they've taken over Hambantota port and 68 square miles around it as part of this neocolonial project. So yes, troublesome. Well, Wai Ching is a one-man questioning army. So he now asks, what do you feel of the role of Davos, World Economic Forum? Well, I think Davos is, of course, a place where the global elite meet every year, and they have, Now, I think one of the features of the world as we now see it is that we actually are beginning to see extreme inequality within countries and among countries. And this is clearly a major world problem. For at least 20 years after the end of the Cold War, we had some convergence. The rest of the world was beginning to catch up. The poorer countries were catching up with the West, and that was a positive development. But I think the corporate interests are taking too much precedence at the World Economic Forum and WTO and so on. So there is a need for some pushback, and I think that's what Wai Ching is hinting at. Okay, I think all right, Wai Ching, I'll try to join you. Thank you. Thank you very much for the time. Bogdan, I think, is telling me that I need to wrap up. Thank you very much for listening. I have pointed to a few places where the book is available. It is available from Amazon in the United States. The book is called Asia Reborn. And well, full name is Asia Reborn, A Continent Rises from the Ravages of Colonialism and War to a New Dynamism. And so it's available at Kinokuniya in Singapore, on Amazon in the United States and the UK, as well as Amazon in India and Flipkart in India. Thank you very much for listening.